Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Penn from thecreativepenn.com and today I'm here with J Daniel Sawyer. Hi Dan.
Hey, Joanna. Good to
Hey,
see you again.
yeah, great to have you back on the show. So, everyone, Dan is the author of 13 books across sci fi and fantasy, mystery, non fiction, and lots of short stories, as well as being an award nominated podcaster, audio producer, and voiceover artist. And Dan's latest non fiction book is Making Tracks, a writer's guide to audiobooks and how to produce them, which we're talking about today. So, I'm really excited about this, Dan, and I wanted to start with sort of asking you, like, why do you love audio? What is so special about it, and why should people even care?
When I was about 4 years old, I was playing hide and seek in the living room, hiding behind the living room couch on Sunday, and NPR was on in the background, and it was a classical music show, and it shifted midway through the hide and seek game to the Star Wars radio drama. At 4 years old, Star Wars was my favorite thing in the world. And it was telling more of the radio drama goes into a lot more depth in the story than the film does. And I'm sitting here listening to this movie that I can follow without seeing it. And it was the most magical thing I had ever experienced. And I never got over that. I was the kid that used to stay up in high school or in elementary school till 1 a.m. so I could tape classic radio theater off of ABC radio in the middle of the night on my little cassette recorder, and then listen to it again anytime I wanted a bedtime story or something. I always wanted to do that, and I was really bummed that the medium kind of died by the time I was in high school. But the internet has brought it back, and which is fabulous for me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. And of course, I do a podcast, and it's a slightly different thing, but we'll get into that in a moment. But I think you're right about the kind of magic. And humans have always listened to stories, of course, haven't they?
Yes. Yeah, human culture begins with sitting around a campfire telling each other stories.
Mm.
Uh, Religion, science, art, it all starts at that campfire 150,000 years ago, telling stories in order to keep the monsters out.
Yeah, although now it's more likely to be on a commute or in a car or something.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Which is and we'll come back to the money side, but let's start about the difference between an audiobook and a podcast like this, or podcast fiction. So what's the difference between an audiobook and a podcast?
Essentially, assuming you're leaving aside informational podcasts like this one, which have their analog more in interview radio shows, the difference between a fiction podcast and an audiobook is essentially the delivery format. Average 120,000 word audiobook is going to run about 12 hours. And in an audiobook, you divvy it up into 60 or 70 minute chunks, or chapter length chunks, depending on whether you're distributing it on CD or in MP3. And you put it in the store, people buy it, people listen to it. On a podcast, you divvy it up into chunks where you tailor the length. It's very important to make the length consistent because people listen on their morning commute.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to have each episode run between 20 and 40 minutes. And so you cut the podcast out at those lengths, maybe slipping it a few minutes this way and that, so you make sure you always end on a cliffhanger. It's one of those best practices things. But people subscribe to it in iTunes. They download it to their iPod, or they subscribe through other channels and download it to their non-Apple personal media player. And they can listen to it anywhere. Podcast, you generally don't charge for. Audiobooks, you always do. So podcast for the business-minded writer is essentially fan service. It's an advertising medium. It's something you do to give something to your hardcore fans who are supporting you.
Mm.
The conversion rate when you're giving stuff away, if you're doing it as advertising from the grassroots, conversion rate on anything is absurdly low in advertising. You're lucky to get 1%. So if 1 out of every 100 people that listen buy something that you produce when they hadn't heard of you before, you're doing spectacularly well. But if you concentrate your fiction podcast towards that core of your audience that interacts with you a lot, that invests in you heavily, those are your evangelists. And that's where the business case for podcasting comes in.
And from a personal point of view, I heard of you through podcasting, certainly, and Scott Sigler, who I got recommended. He's an early podcaster, and I started listening. I listened to one of his free podcast books, and then subsequently bought his book. So it definitely can. But as you say, it is difficult to get a particular correlation. But it's good.
Emphasizing the business downside first. You know what the worst is, and then you can get on with having fun.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because and I use very basic production for this podcast because I one of my aims is to talk to people like you and to enjoy it myself, and I don't want to do all of the technical stuff. But to do a full-on audiobook like you've done, and also kind of audio production where you have multiple voice actors and things, it seems very technical. And your book, Making Tracks, has a lot of the technical detail in, but that can be quite scary. So if people want to do their own audiobooks, do they need all this technical stuff, and or what kind of equipment do they need?
So the way I laid the book out is I start out with the history of audiobooks. So you understand the world you're stepping into. And then I go through the business, the current marketplaces, how the marketplace has evolved, what's reasonable to expect from the marketplace going forward. And so that you can figure out how you're going to make money at this, because it is a tremendous time sink, and we are in business. The business is there primarily to justify the fact that we like telling stories to people, but we still have to be able to pay rent in order to tell those stories, right?
Yeah.
From there I go into, in order, what you need to know to do anything from a regular audiobook to a full cast audiobook, or to a full production radio drama even. So I start off with the basics of acoustical theory, which is the most technical and the most scary, but if you don't have it down and you come out with a recording problem, you will never be able to solve it. And it's actually a fairly short chapter. It's about 6 pages. I just go into what you need to know. I leave out everything you don't, as garnered from, 12 years of experience doing audio production of various sorts now. And then from there I go into things like casting actors and managing the logistics of a larger scale production and doing sound effects and commissioning music and doing environmental audio effects so that it's immersive rather than just talking. It sounds more like a movie. You can ignore all that stuff and still have a great single-read audiobook, and the perfect example of that is Nathan Lowell, who does no production whatsoever, aside from having a very good basic recording setup and a very good understanding of editing. The man, for a long time, recorded in his car because it was the quietest place he could find. And it worked supremely well. The audience will engage with the story as long as your production level is consistent throughout the book and is clean enough. If the first chapter sounds great and the second chapter sounds crappy and the third chapter you can hear your dog barking in the background, your audience will throw you away. But if you're recording on a substandard microphone in an otherwise quiet room without a lot of room reverb, after about the first 30 seconds, the audience won't hear the background noise that your electronics are generating. The trick is consistency. And in order to get the consistency, you have to understand a little bit of the science of acoustics, but not a lot.
Yeah, and I think that's key. And you said that the audience connect, and I do think that's really important. And one of the reasons I'm attracted to the kind of the author reading is partly that kind of connection. What do you think? Matt, what do you think happens when you have somebody else read it? Is there any difference, do you think?
Well, yeah, it's reading, even the most basic reading, is an interpretation of the book. The book that you listen to that I wrote, is different than the book you'll hear in your head if you read it off the page. The moment you put any human being in between the naked words and your brain, you're getting an interpretive filter. The author is going to have a different interpretation of the little nuances in the book than will an experienced actor. If the author isn't very good at reading, the author may actually kill the interpretation, not convey his own interpretation. and an actor could be better. It's completely a matter of artistic choice. But every choice you make does change the experience for the listener.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that, what is the difference between reading and performance?
Okay, so let's see. I'll get one of mine so that I'm not doing copyright infringement. You remember when you were in, I think it's a secondary school where you guys are at, junior high for the U.S., and you first started having to do oral reports. And people would have to stand at their desk and read something they wrote. And I'll read the first bit of my story, Train Time. So, reading in the style of someone who's just reading the words off the page, like Stephen Hawking's computer reads the words he types with his cheek muscles. Tap, tap, tap. The cane foot tapped measuredly on the plank, hammering out a steady tick-tock rhythm. And the whole thing feels mechanical. And even I'm doing it better than I've got in my head because you get enough practice at this. Continuing on in that vein, it was not a rubber foot such has been commonly seen on cane feet for a century now, but a proper steel cane foot suitable for a weapon or a prop to lean on or a scepter with which to gesticulate, which is awful.
So and it's sort of monotonous. That's that's one of the points.
It's monotonous. You're conveying the words, but you're not conveying the sentence or the meaning, as opposed to tap, tap, tap. The cane foot tapped measuredly on the plank, hanging out a steady tick-tock rhythm. It was not a rubber foot, such as had been common on cane feet for a century now, but a proper pinned steel cane foot, suitable for a weapon or a prop to lean on, or a scepter with which to just... and, of course, I flub. Or a scepter with which to gesticulate.
Yeah, awesome.
And that draws you in to the story and what's going on.
And actually, it's even, and even just aside from audiobooks, right, when people read at festivals and things, mostly authors are diabolical at reading this, right? So I think your tips, even just the way you did it there, that's important whether you're reading live or, on a recording.
Yeah. And the book does have a long chapter on the dynamics of performance and how to grow into a performer that can read your own audiobooks. Because it's not, as we know from countless Transformer movies, technique is no good if it's not backed up by heart and performance. The story is always, no matter how fancy your production, the story has to be central or it will not work.
No, absolutely. And another thing that people have is, I hate my voice. So
everybody hates their voice, and I'll tell you why. The voice you hear in your head is not the voice the people around you hear. In your head, you're hearing the bone conduction from your skull and your jaw, in addition to the sound of your voice bouncing off the walls around you. So your voice sound, and those bones in your head emphasize the low tones, the rich tones, the warm tones. And so when you hear your voice mic'd badly, i.e. mic'd the way people sitting about 2 feet away from you will hear it, it sounds to you flat and tinny and unemotional and really garish. The way you fix that, first of all, is you learn to hear the difference, and you can modulate the way you speak in order to convey what you're hearing in your head forward. You drop your voice about 2-3 notes below your normal speaking voice. But you can also use a good dynamic microphone. And the reason is, if you listen, I've got the gain turned pretty high up, so this may blow it out, but let's hope it doesn't. As I'm speaking right now, you're getting a fairly listenable signal. I sound just like a guy talking in a room, which is what I am. But if I come up this close, it sounds much more as if I'm whispering in your ear. There's the technique. My technique changes a little bit because the proximity sort of slips me into the speaking into someone's ear mode. But the microphone itself, because of the way it's built, the closer you get, the more it emphasizes those tones that you're already hearing through bone conduction. And then you can also use equalization curves to tweak that as well. So if you hate your own voice, don't worry. Now, it is possible that you have a voice that is just never going to work. You may be tone deaf in the wrong way. You may have, there's a few basic, very common congenital defects in the back of the sinuses that can sort of up your diction and make you sound really nasally like this, even when you're being serious. And you'll never get past that. There's no fix for that. And at that point, it's much better to hire someone else. But assuming that you don't have... There's some accents that'll push you that way. My native Texas accent from when I was a young child, that does that naturally. But if you can acquire muscle control to open up the back of your sinuses and your throat, you can negate that. However, some people can't. Probably 1-2% of people just don't have that physiological ability. And if you don't, hire an actor.
Yeah.
Get your partner to read your book. Or there are other circumstances too. Like when I write from a first person female perspective, no one on earth is going to take me seriously reading the first person story of Lilith, for example. It just won't happen. So I bring actors in for that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Although Scott Sigler still reads his female voices,
and he makes it work because he knows he sucks at it, and so he makes it an in-joke with the audience. And now, if you're doing a single read, there's a number of ways you can read the opposite gender and make it work. One is if you can really do a fairly convincing voice, then you're golden. But if you can't, like if I was doing a single read, I would do either the Jordan Bridges technique. He's Jeff Bridges' son. He does a lot of audiobooks. Or I'd do the Nathan Lowell technique. Nathan Lowell's technique is to read along. So he said this and this and this, and she said this and this and this. And it's just the slightest little shift in pitch and pacing. Jordan Bridges uses no shift at all. He just shifts pacing. And he shifts pacing and he makes his voice softer rather than higher pitched. So this would be Jordan Bridges using a male voice, and this would be Jordan Bridges using a female voice. And as long as it's consistent throughout the book, the way you're doing your characterization, the audience, it will become transparent to the audience. The audience will not remember hearing your voice speaking in an opposite sex fake accent. They will remember the character speaking, because their own brain will do the rest of the work. The trick is to know the different points at which you can leave the audience to do their thing. There's some places you don't want to leave them because they won't make the connection. There's other places where they will do all the work for you. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. And so then if people want to use a voice artist, how do they go about finding one?
You can join ACX and shop around for voice artists there. You can get in some weird contractual obligations to Amazon doing that, which is a whole other thing. You go on to the voiceover industry is huge. So there's any number of voiceover listing and audition sites you can go on to and look at. If you listen to a lot of audiobooks, pay attention to who's reading. And give them, find their website and drop them an email. They're all freelancers. They're all always looking for work.
Yeah.
If you can afford them, they'll be yours. And because they're freelancers, they may be willing to cut you a deal. Or if you're not quite there yet, if you don't have a budget, talk to your friends. Go to a local community theater. Go to a local community college. Get a young and hungry actor who's got the chops but not the resume yet.
Yeah.
And work out a deal where they will get paid for their time. Please never do a commercial project and don't pay people. You can get sued and it can get ugly. As well as being wrong, it's just ugly.
Yeah.
But pay them something that is good for them that you can afford. Work out a deferred payment plan, whatever it is that you can do. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can handle it. But bring them in, set up a studio, get them reading for you.
No, that's great. Actually, I like that. I think you're right. There's a hell of a lot of actors out there who would probably jump at the chance.
Actors get more respect than writers, but they make less money.
Yeah, they make less money, exactly.
Which means that we have the power in the relationship
Yeah.
as writers and directors.
That's true. So a couple of things there then. First of all, can we talk about editing? Because clearly there's, as you just read there and you screwed up the last word. So when you do that, when you're reading, I mean, obviously if you're sitting there reading for hours, you're going to make mistakes all the time. What is the type of ratio with editing to recording?
When you're really, really good, you're only doing a single read. Like you're not doing full cast, you're not doing much music, you're not doing sound effects, you're not doing environmental effects. If it's just you and the microphone, and you're really good, I mean like you've got several books under your belt and you can do this in your sleep, you can get your production ratio down to about 3 or 4 to 1. Which means that for every 4 hours you spend working on it, you'll get an hour of finished audio. Typically, when you're starting, expect 10 to 1, and then expect when you get pretty good for it to drop eventually to about 6 to 1.
Yeah, that's just... And everyone's going, oh my goodness, that is crazy, right? That is crazy. Now,
that's why audiobooks cost $5,000 to $10,000 a piece to produce.
Yeah.
So if you're going to a professional studio.
Yeah, so let's then talk about ACX. Now, for people who don't know, maybe you could explain what ACX is and what they can do there.
ACX is the Audiobook Creators Exchange. It's owned by Audible, which is owned by Amazon, and it's designed to be a marketplace by which Audible can acquire exclusive content. You don't have to do an exclusive deal with Audible, but they really, really make it hard to turn down because of the royalty scale they offer. What they do is it's basically a forum or a classified listing thing where authors hunt for producers, and in this case, producer means a dude with a microphone who can read, right? And you trade out, you connect with each other, you listen to auditions, you find audio talent that is good for you for your book. And you negotiate a rate. Professional rates are anywhere from about $80 per finished hour to about $600 per finished hour. That you as the creator would pay to the producer. Then there's a number of ways you can do this. You can either pay them cash, in which case Amazon Audible has no claim whatsoever on the work. And you don't owe them anything in the future. It's a cash deal, it's done. Or you can do a royalty split, where you basically both of you retain 50% of the copyright to the production, and Amazon gets exclusive distribution rights because they manage the payment schedule. And then half of the royalties go to you, half go to them, and Amazon retains the exclusive audio rights to your work for 7 years.
Yeah.
And the royalty schedule depends on the sales volume. It starts at about 25%. It goes up to about 75% of cover price. And there's stair steps all the way up depending on how many you're selling. I think it's every 500 units you sell, you get another 1% or another 5% bump or something like that. I'd have to look at it. And I don't have it in front of me. But that's basically what ACX is. ACX is essentially audiobook production marketplace for lazy people. I'm not saying it's not useful, but there are a few things about it I don't like.
Okay, tell us.
The most important thing about it I don't like is the exclusivity. Yes, Audible owns 90% of the audiobook marketplace online at the moment.
Yeah.
But the online audiobook marketplace is only about 60-70% of the audiobook marketplace. Audiobooks are one of those commodities that sell fabulously in gift shops because a great deal of the audiobook consuming public, at least in the US, are truck drivers. And truck drivers will look at something when they're filling up for gas next to the donuts, and they'll say, oh, that looks like an interesting book, I'll just grab that. A huge number of audiobooks are sold that way. And they're sold in bookstores, and they're sold in other gift shops at casinos and airports and all sorts of stuff. So if you're going exclusive with Audible, you're A, missing that whole segment of the market. Just like if you go exclusive with with KDP Select. You're missing all the other online marketplaces. Well, with the Audible thing, you're missing all the physical marketplaces too. So I don't like that. Second is they've got 90% of the online marketplace right now, and they've got that because they've got an exclusive distribution deal with iTunes. That deal expires in the next year or two. Okay. And Amazon and Apple are not the friends they once were. Apple is attempting to set itself up as its own content distribution platform, as well as movies, or as well as computers and devices. So there's a good likelihood that 1-2 years down the road, Amazon will have 60% of the market or 50%, and Apple will have a big chunk of what's left, and suddenly you won't be there. So in a marketplace that's as volatile as ours, exclusivity for any substantial length of time, I think, is a very bad idea.
No, fair enough. I think,
but like I said, you can use ACX to your advantage if you can do a cash deal without doing exclusivity, and it is that way. It's the easiest way to get into Audible. There are other ways, though, to get into Audible. If, for example, you live in the UK where ACX is not available to you.
Exactly.
There's a number of companies online. I list some of them in my book right now. I don't want to name names because I don't want to be seen to be endorsing any of them.
Yeah.
But there are a number of companies online that aggregate, in the same way that Smashwords aggregates ebooks, they aggregate small studio audiobooks and distribute them to major online marketplaces, in some cases also to major physical marketplaces. And most of them do not require exclusivity, so you could list with several of them and get in their catalogs. And that's more chances for buyers at stores to see your name, to see your product, to buy your book and put it on their shelves. And almost all of those distributors also sell to Audible. The royalty share is not quite as generous, just like selling a physical book through Amazon, through Ingram's, is not as lucrative as selling a physical book through Amazon through CreateSpace. Because when Amazon owns the whole supply chain, they're willing to give you more of the cut. But you still can get presence in the Amazon store that way.
Yeah, and it's all quite complicated. Let's put it this way. I mean, I think most of us are now quite comfortable with ebook publishing and print book publishing, and audiobook publishing seems to me to be the next kind of frontier. And someone like you's very happy with it all, and you know what you're doing, and you know where the kind of scams are. I feel like this is a bit of the next step for indies, is taking books into audio. But of course, you've talked quite a lot there about it sounds like a lot of time. It could be potentially expensive, but what are some of the potential financial returns? As in, is it worth doing financially, not just for fun?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Audiobooks are the third biggest chunk of income that an independent writer, that any writer in fact, can earn. Which means if you're mainstream published, next time you go to negotiate, try to hold on to those audiobook rights, because all the publisher does is sell them to a studio like mine in order to recoup some of your advance. Then they don't get much royalty stream from that studio. They're just trying to offset their losses they paid to you. If you retain those rights, this is another long-tail income stream. Audiobooks represent about 20% overall of the book-buying market. It's way huger than it was 15 years ago. 15 years ago, the only people that listened to audiobooks were truck drivers and blind people. Now, it's going everywhere, and the growth curve is slower and more consistent than the ebook growth curve. Ebook went boom, and now it's dropping to what's going to eventually be its plateau, which will probably be 20 to 30% of the market for the next 5-10 years before it has another big bump as one generation dies off and another comes in. Audiobooks don't have, because it's spoken word, they don't have the technological resistance barrier that you do with ebooks. Everybody likes having a story told to them, and so the potential appeal is market wide, and the growth curve is gentle, but it's persistent. There's no boom bust cycle going on. It's just a nice, gentle, persistent growth curve. And you want to have access to those readers, because some of those people will never read a book. I've got a brother who's dyslexic. He loves my stuff. He's a huge evangelist for my books. He has never read one. Yeah. He's listened to all the audiobooks I've done. But for him to read a magazine article takes longer than it does for me to read a novella. And it's just torture for him. So he's never going to do it. And there's a lot of people like that. Mm. And these are the people that listen to podcasts and watch YouTube videos. And that's a segment of the market you don't have access to if you're not producing audiobooks. Mm. And if you're not producing your own audiobooks, your access to that market is greatly removed. And you're only getting a nickel off a royalty stream where you could be getting 50, 75 cents.
Yeah. No, it's there's so much to think about in this area, and I really urge people to get your book, because it's very detailed and people can find out about all of this stuff. I cover
all this stuff in considerable depth in very accessible terms.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I did find the technical bit a little bit scary, but the rest of it was like, yeah, this is totally good, and I this is definitely an area I want to get into. I think it's amazing, really, and I also think with the smartphones, more and more people having smartphones, the fact that it's much easier to access this content, and like you say, if Apple's going to have their own stream, then that changes things. But yeah, and what I also, from what you're saying, and I think about this a lot, is that, as you say, things change so fast, like every week at the moment. Yeah. And if you sign away your rights without a specific end limit, like I think the ACX 7-year thing, like 7 years of exclusivity, is like, okay, that's not actually that long if you think about how old you and I are. We've got all these other years ahead of us.
7 years is not a long time in terms of your copyright. Mm-hmm. It's a long time in terms of its relationship to a very volatile marketplace. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. And so much of publishing, particularly indie publishing, but even regular publishing, it is predicated on the fact that you continue to have the exclusive right to make money off your books for 70 years past when you die.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Which I think is stupid, frankly, but that's the system we're in. That's the system we've got to take advantage of. Mm. And if you're not constructing your business strategy to take advantage of the fact that a book that earns $100 a year for the next 100 years is making you more money in the aggregate than a book that you get a small advance for, you're not thinking clearly. And when we publish a book, even if it sells poorly, we are essentially getting free money after we sell about 500 copies in terms of the time it takes to write a book. Term of the time it takes to write and produce an audiobook, it would take a few more copies than that. Sold at a little higher price. But even so, what makes a failure of a book in the old world makes a pension fund now.
Yes.
And if ever you sign a contract for any kind of exclusive distribution, whether it's with a magazine or a traditional publisher or an audiobook publisher or a movie studio, you either need to make sure you're getting paid as if you were God, or there needs to be an expiration date. Relationship.
No, I totally agree, and I really encourage people to listen to what you're saying and to what we're everything we're saying here is, it's not just one book. It's like, it's an ebook, it's a print book, it's an audiobook, it's other rights.
One of these days I've got the notes on my computer to write a short book on this subject. A few years ago, I was trying to figure out how to track all my different rights sales, so I know when I had new things come back around to be able to sell again. And at that point, I only had about 15 properties, novels and short stories, and an old movie that I did, and some other stuff like that. And I started to do a spreadsheet. And I was running, spreadsheets are infinite, so you can't actually run out of columns. But I was getting so far off to this side of the spreadsheet that I couldn't tell what title I was dealing with anymore. So I decided I needed to make a list. I called up a writer friend of mine. She came over. We sat for about an hour. We came up with a list of rights generated by a single short story. 4 pages long, single spaced, and then we gave up. because we didn't finish, we gave up. But you can sell even every short story you write, theoretically, that many times. And that's if you only sell each of those rights once. But with copyright terms being so long, the reality is that unless you sign a really bad contract, you're going to be able to sell each of those rights numerous times over your lifetime if you're careful about pursuing exploiting those rights.
Yeah, and it's funny when you talk about a pension fund, because you know, with all the financial crisis and things like that, having shares and stuff like that, you're just not going to earn us any money in like 30 years time. So my husband now says that I am his retirement fund. You know, that every book we're creating as an asset will actually make more money in 30 years time when we in quotes retire. But of course we'll carry on writing and doing all this till we die, won't we?
Yep.
It's fantastic. I took such a brilliant career choice. Right, well, I love talking to you, but we're time to go. So tell us, where can people find some of your audio performances and the book and you in general?
You can find all my stuff at www.jdsawyer.net. My paperbacks and ebooks are in fashionable retailers everywhere. My audiobooks are not in fashionable retailers everywhere yet, because when I started producing them for podcast, I didn't cover my ass legally, and so now I'm having to go back and get voice releases from all my talent. Because at the time I was doing it, I wasn't thinking like a businessman. I was thinking like an indie filmmaker, and I was like, it'll never make any money. I don't need to worry about it. So, but I've got several other audiobooks in production now that are legally covered. And eventually all my audiobooks will be available everywhere. But until then, you can find them also at jdsawyer.net in the form of podcasts and such like.
Fantastic. And just tell us again about the name of the book.
The name of the book is Making Tracks, A Writer's Guide to Audiobooks and How to Produce Them. And by the time this airs, it should be available in paperback and ebook pretty much everywhere.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time, Dan. That was brilliant.
For having me.